The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, and I knew it was trouble before I even opened the envelope with the Highland Meadows HOA return address stamped across the top. My name is Quincy Garrett, and I had been living peacefully in my modest ranch house on the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, for 3 years without much interaction with the Homeowners Association. I kept to myself, maintained my property well enough, and generally tried to stay under the radar. The house had belonged to my grandfather, passed down to me after he died, and it represented the only real stability I had ever known in my life. I worked as a freelance software developer, which meant I spent most of my time at home, watching the snow pile up outside my window during these brutal winter months. I tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter, my eyes scanning the formal language with growing disbelief. According to the Highland Meadows HOA, I was being fined $1,500 for failure to remove snow from my driveway and walkway within the required 24-hour period following a snowfall. The letter was signed by one Patricia Henderson, HOA president, and it cited Section 12.7 of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that apparently governed my property. The thing was, I had removed the snow. Sure, maybe it took me 36 hours instead of 24, but I had a legitimate excuse. I had been dealing with a severe case of the flu, barely able to get out of bed, let alone operate a snow shovel in sub-zero temperatures. I had eventually dragged myself outside and cleared everything once I could stand without feeling like I was going to pass out. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number listed on the letterhead. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice sharp and clipped. Highland Meadows HOA, this is Patricia speaking. Hi, my name is Quincy Garrett. I just received a letter about a fine for snow removal violations, and I think there has been a misunderstanding. Let me pull up your file. I heard the clicking of a keyboard. Yes, Mr. Garrett. You were observed to have snow accumulation exceeding 3 inches on your driveway and front walkway for more than 24 hours following the snowfall on January 8th. This is a clear violation of our community standards. I understand that, but I was sick with the flu. I removed it as soon as I physically could. I think under the circumstances, some leniency would be appropriate. Patricia's voice turned icy. Mr. Garrett, the rules exist for everyone equally. We cannot make exceptions based on personal situations, or else the entire system would fall apart. The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay or we will place a lien on your property. I felt my jaw clench. A lien over snow removal, that seems excessive. Those are the rules you agreed to when you purchased property in this community. Have a good day, Mr. Garrett. She hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone, anger bubbling up in my chest. $1,500 for being 12 hours late on snow removal while I was sick seemed absolutely insane. I had savings, sure, but that was a significant chunk of money to fork over for something so trivial. Over the next week, I tried to appeal the decision through the proper channels. I submitted a written appeal to the HOA board, complete with a doctor's note confirming I had been ill during the time in question. I even offered to pay a reduced fine as a compromise. Every attempt was met with the same response. The rules were the rules, and exceptions could not be made. I started doing research into the Highland Meadows HOA, trying to understand what I was dealing with. What I found was a long history of aggressive enforcement and complaints from other homeowners. Patricia Henderson had been president for 7 years, and during that time, the number of fines and violations had increased dramatically. There were stories online about people being fined for having the wrong shade of mailbox, for parking in their own driveways at the wrong time of day, and for having grass that was a quarter-inch too long. It was during this research that I stumbled across something interesting. While digging through old property records at the Boulder County Clerk's office, trying to understand the exact boundaries of my property and what I had actually agreed to when I inherited the house, I found a survey from 1973. The survey showed something that made my heart skip a beat. The access road that led into the Highland Meadows development, the main road that every single resident used to reach their homes, ran directly through a parcel of land that had belonged to my grandfather. I traced the property lines carefully, checking them against more recent surveys and the deed to my house. Unless I was reading this completely wrong, my grandfather had owned that strip of land, which meant I now owned it. I spent the next several days verifying this information. I hired a surveyor to come out and confirm the boundaries. I paid for a title search to make absolutely certain there had been no transfer of ownership. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. I owned the access road. Apparently, back in the 1970s, when the Highland Meadows development was first being planned, the developer had approached my grandfather about purchasing a right-of-way through his land. My grandfather, from what I could piece together from old letters I found in the attic, had refused to sell, but had agreed to allow the road to be built with the understanding that a formal easement agreement would be drawn up later. For whatever reason, that easement agreement had never been finalized. The developer had gone bankrupt in the early 80s, the property had changed hands multiple times, and somehow this detail had been lost in the shuffle. The HOA and all the residents of Highland Meadows had been using my road for decades without any legal right to do so. I sat in my living room, staring at the stack of documents spread across my coffee table, my mind racing. The fine notice from Patricia Henderson was pinned to my refrigerator, a constant reminder of the $1,500 she expected me to pay. An idea began to form, risky and potentially petty, but satisfying in a way that made me smile for the first time in weeks. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. According to the bylaws I had read, any homeowner in the community had the right to attend and speak during the public comment period. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community center, a small building near the entrance of the development. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the back row. The room gradually filled with about 20 other residents, most of them looking bored or resigned. Patricia Henderson sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by 4 other board members. She was exactly what I had pictured. A woman in her early 50s with carefully styled blonde hair, sharp features, and an expression that suggested she had never met a rule she did not want to enforce. The meeting began with standard business. Minutes from the previous meeting were approved, financial reports were presented, and various maintenance issues were discussed. Then Patricia opened the floor for new business and violations. "We have several new violation notices to discuss," she said, shuffling through papers. "First, we have the Garrett property at 42 Pinecrest Drive. Snow removal violation, fine of $1,500. Mr. Garrett submitted an appeal claiming illness, but the board has voted to uphold the fine." I raised my hand. "I am here and I would like to speak about that." Patricia looked up, her eyes narrowing when she saw me. "Mr. Garrett, the board has already made its decision. There is nothing further to discuss." "I think there is plenty to discuss," I said, standing up. "I think the fine is excessive and unreasonable, especially given the circumstances. I was documented as being ill with a fever of 102 degrees. I cleared the snow as soon as I was physically able." One of the other board members, a balding man whose nameplate read Robert Chen, Treasurer, spoke up. "Mr. Garrett, We understand your situation, but we have to maintain standards. If we let one person slide, everyone will want exceptions. So you are saying that even if someone is hospitalized, they would still be fined? Patricia's voice cut through the room. We are saying that homeowners are responsible for maintaining their properties according to our standards. If you cannot fulfill those responsibilities, you need to make arrangements, hire a snow removal service, ask a neighbor, but the rules exist for the good of the community and they must be enforced. I could feel the anger rising again, but I kept my voice level. I see. So the rules are absolute no matter what. That is correct, Patricia said with a tight smile. Good to know, I said. I will keep that in mind. I left the meeting without paying the fine, my decision solidifying with each step I took back to my car. If Patricia Henderson wanted to play by the rules with no exceptions and no mercy, then I would do exactly the same. The next morning, I contacted a real estate attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in property disputes. I brought him all my documentation, the old surveys, the title search, the deed to my property, and everything else I had gathered. He spent 2 hours reviewing everything, making notes and occasionally looking up case law on his computer. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me. This is legitimate. You own that access road. There is no recorded easement, no right-of-way agreement, nothing. Legally, every time someone from that HOA drives over your property, they are trespassing. What are my options? I asked. Marcus tapped his pen against his desk. Well, you could grant them an easement. That would be the neighborly thing to do, though you could negotiate payment for it. Or you could restrict access. Put up a gate, post no trespassing signs. Technically, it is your property and you have every right to control who uses it. What would happen if I restricted access? They would probably sue you. It would be a complicated case. They could argue something called prescriptive easement, claiming they have used the road openly and continuously for so long that they have earned the right to continue using it. But that is not a guaranteed win for them, especially since the HOA is a legal entity that should have done proper due diligence on property rights. Plus, prescriptive easements typically require 20 years of use in Colorado, and if your grandfather gave them permission initially, even informally, that could interrupt the clock on the prescriptive easement claim. Marcus leaned forward. Here is what I think you should do. Send them a formal notice that you own the property and that you are willing to negotiate an easement agreement. Give them 30 days to respond. If they refuse to negotiate in good faith, or if they ignore you, then you have more leverage for whatever comes next. I like this approach. It was measured and gave them a chance to be reasonable. Let's do it. Marcus drafted a letter that laid everything out in clear legal language. It included copies of all the relevant documentation and offered to discuss terms for a formal easement agreement. He suggested a fee of $1 per year, which was essentially nominal, just to make it clear that this was a legal agreement and not a gift. The letter was sent via certified mail to the HOA board, with Patricia Henderson listed as the primary recipient. I also had copies sent to each individual board member at their home addresses, just to make sure everyone was informed. Then I waited. 3 days passed with no response. Then a week. I was starting to wonder if they were just going to ignore the letter entirely when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia Henderson's number. Mr. Garrett, this is Patricia Henderson. I received your letter and I have to say, I find it highly inappropriate and bordering on harassment. Harassment? I am informing you of a legal issue regarding property rights. That is not harassment. Your claims are ridiculous, she said. That road has been part of this community for over 40 years. You cannot just suddenly claim to own it. I am not suddenly claiming anything. I do own it. The documentation is very clear. Did you review the materials I sent? I glanced at them. They are probably forgeries or based on outdated information. I am not going to waste the HOA's time and money chasing down your fantasy. I felt a surge of satisfaction at her dismissive tone. She was making this easier than I had hoped. So you are refusing to negotiate an easement agreement? There is nothing to negotiate. That road belongs to the community. If you continue with this nonsense, we will take legal action against you. I see. Well, thank you for clarifying your position. I paused. By the way, I assume you have decided to waive the fine you issued me for the snow removal violation. Patricia actually laughed. Absolutely not. In fact, since you have now missed the 30-day deadline, the fine has increased to $2,000, and we are moving forward with placing a lien on your property. Interesting, I said. We will see how that works out for you. I hung up and immediately called Marcus Webb. They refused to negotiate and threatened to sue me. What is our next step? Marcus sighed. Well, you have given them fair notice. At this point, you are within your rights to restrict access to your property. But I want to be very clear about something. This is going to create a major problem for that entire community. Are you sure you want to go down this road? I thought about Patricia's condescending tone, her complete unwillingness to show any flexibility or human decency, her threat to place a lien on my property over a snow removal violation while I was sick. Yes, I am sure. All right. Let me file a quiet title action to get a court judgment confirming your ownership. In the meantime, you can post no trespassing signs, but I would not recommend physically blocking the road until we have that judgment. It will just give them ammunition to paint you as the bad guy. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Marcus to file the quiet title action in Boulder County District Court. The lawsuit named the Highland Meadows HOA as the defendant and asked the court to officially confirm that I owned the access road and that no easement existed. We attached all the survey documents, title history, and everything else we had gathered. The HOA was formally served with the lawsuit on a Friday afternoon. I was not present, but I would have loved to see Patricia's face when she received those papers. The following Monday, my phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors I had barely ever spoken to were calling, asking what was going on. Some were polite, trying to understand the situation. Others were angry, accusing me of trying to trap them or hold them hostage. I kept my responses consistent. I owned the road, I had offered to negotiate an easement for a nominal fee, the HOA had refused, and now the courts would decide. On Tuesday evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a man in his 60s wearing an expensive suit. He introduced himself as Richard Pembroke, an attorney representing the Highland Meadows HOA. Mr. Garrett, may I come in? I think we should talk about this situation like reasonable adults. I stepped aside and let him enter. We sat in my living room, and he placed his briefcase on the coffee table. I have reviewed your claim, Richard said, and I will admit, you have uncovered a significant oversight in the property records. However, I think you must understand the practical implications of what you are doing. There are 147 homes in Highland Meadows. That access road is the only way in and out of the community. If you block it, you will be preventing families with children, elderly residents, emergency services from accessing their homes. I understand all of that, I said. Which is why I offered to negotiate an easement for $1 a year. That is about as reasonable as it gets. Yes, about that. Richard pulled out some papers. We are prepared to offer you $10,000 for a permanent easement. This would resolve the issue completely and compensate you for any inconvenience. I was not expecting that. $10,000 was real money, especially compared to the $1,500 fine I was fighting, but something about the offer felt wrong. "Let me think about it," I said. "I will discuss it with my attorney and get back to you." Richard looked disappointed but nodded. "Please do not take too long. This situation is causing significant stress for the community." After he left, I called Marcus and told him about the offer. $10,000 for a permanent easement is actually pretty low, Marcus said. Considering they have no other options, and that road is essential to their entire community, you could probably get significantly more. But here is the real question. Is this about the money for you, or is it about the principle? I thought about that. Both, honestly. I do not want to be unreasonable or hurt innocent people who have nothing to do with this. But I also do not want to roll over for an HOA that has been completely inflexible and cruel. Here is my suggestion, Marcus said. Counteroffer. Tell them you will grant the easement for free, permanently, with only one condition. The HOA must rescind your fine, issue a formal apology, and revise their enforcement policies to include a hardship exemption process for situations like yours. Make it about fixing the system, not just about your personal grievance. I love this idea. It addressed the actual problem and would potentially help other homeowners in the future. Let's do it. I drafted a response and sent it to Richard Pembroke the next day. The counter-offer was exactly as Marcus had suggested. A free permanent easement in exchange for rescinding my fine, a formal written apology from the board, and implementation of a hardship exemption policy that would be added to the HOA bylaws. The response came back within 24 hours. It was from Patricia Henderson directly, not from the attorney. The email was short and venomous. "We will not negotiate with someone attempting to extort this community. Your demands are outrageous. We will see you in court." I forwarded the email to Marcus. He called me 10 minutes later, laughing. "She just made a huge mistake," he said. "By refusing a completely reasonable offer that would cost them nothing and actually help the community, she has made it clear this is personal for her. When this gets in front of a judge, that is going to matter." So what happens now? Now we wait for the court hearing on the quiet title action. I have also been doing some digging into the HOA's finances and enforcement patterns. Did you know they have issued over $300,000 in fines over the past 3 years? 300,000. I was stunned. Yeah. And get this. The fines seem to be concentrated on a small number of homeowners who get hit repeatedly for minor violations. It looks like targeted harassment in some cases. There is a woman named Dorothy Martinez who has been fined 12 times in 18 months for things like having her trash cans visible from the street and having a garden gnome that was deemed inappropriate. That is insane. It gets better. Guess where a lot of that fine money goes? Patricia Henderson's salary as HOA president has increased from $40,000 to $95,000 over the past 5 years. She is literally profiting from aggressive enforcement. I felt my anger shift into something more calculated. This was not just about my fine anymore. This was about a corrupt system that was hurting people. "Can we use that in court?" I asked. "I am going to try. It speaks to the HOA's bad faith and predatory practices. A judge might be more sympathetic to your position if they understand the context." The court hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which felt like an eternity. In the meantime, the situation in Highland Meadows continued to escalate. The HOA sent out an email to all residents claiming I was trying to hold the community hostage and encouraging people to file complaints against me. My mailbox was vandalized twice. Someone left a nasty note on my windshield, but not everyone was against me. A few neighbors reached out privately to express support. One of them was a woman named Dorothy Martinez, the same person Marcus had mentioned, who had been repeatedly fined. Dorothy knocked on my door on a cold February afternoon, holding a plate of homemade cookies. She was in her 70s, small and thin with warm brown eyes. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "I know this is not easy, but what you are doing is important." I invited her in and we talked for over an hour. She told me stories about the HOA's harassment, how Patricia had made her life miserable over the smallest things. She had almost been forced to sell her house because of the mounting fines. "I have lived here for 23 years, Dorothy said, her voice shaking. "This used to be a wonderful community. But when Patricia took over, everything changed. It became about control and power and money. I have been trying to organize other homeowners to vote her out, but she has made it nearly impossible. She changed the bylaws so that you need 75% of homeowners to vote for removal, and most people are too scared to speak up." "I had no idea it was this bad," I said. "Most people do not. They just pay the fines and stay quiet because they do not want to make trouble. But you are fighting back, and that gives the rest of us hope." Dorothy left eventually, but her words stayed with me. This was bigger than my personal grievance. This was about standing up to a bully who had been abusing her power for years. A week before the court hearing, I received another certified letter from the HOA. This one informed me that they were moving forward with placing a lien on my property for the unpaid fine, which had now ballooned to $3,000 with late fees and administrative charges. I showed the letter to Marcus during our prep session for the hearing. "Let them," he said. "It actually helps our case. It shows they are acting in bad faith while we are in the middle of litigation. The judge is not going to look favorably on that." The day of the hearing arrived. I put on my best suit and met Marcus at the Boulder County Courthouse. We were scheduled in front of Judge Sarah Williams, who, according to Marcus, had a reputation for being no nonsense but fair. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting. Patricia Henderson was there with Richard Pembroke and another attorney I did not recognize. Several other HOA board members sat in the gallery, along with about a dozen residents from Highland Meadows. I spotted Dorothy Martinez sitting near the back, giving me an encouraging nod. Judge Williams entered, and we all stood. She was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She settled into her seat and reviewed the case file for a moment before looking up. "This is an interesting case," she said. "Mr. Garrett is seeking a judgment confirming his ownership of a parcel of land that serves as the sole access road to a residential community of nearly 150 homes. The defendant HOA claims prescriptive easement rights. Let me hear from the plaintiff first." Marcus stood and presented our case methodically. He walked through the property records, the surveys, the title history. He showed how the original developer had never formalized an easement agreement, how that detail had been lost over multiple ownership changes, and how my grandfather's estate, and now, I had continuously owned the land in question. Then he addressed the prescriptive easement argument. "Your Honor, the defendants will likely argue they have earned an easement through continuous use. However, the evidence shows that my client's grandfather gave informal permission for the road to be built. Permission negates the hostile use requirement for prescriptive easement. Furthermore, the HOA, as a legal entity, had an obligation to conduct proper due diligence on property rights. Their failure to do so does not create an automatic right to continue trespassing on my client's land." Finally, Marcus brought up the context of the dispute. "Your Honor, I think it is important to understand how this case came about. Mr. Garrett discovered this property issue while defending himself against what we believe is a predatory fine system. I have documentation here showing that the HOA has issued hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines over the past few years, with much of that money funding increased salaries for board members. Mr. Garrett was fined $1,500 for being 12 hours late removing snow while he was sick with documented flu. When he tried to appeal, the board refused any flexibility. When he offered to grant a free easement in exchange for reasonable policy changes, he was refused. This is not about money for Mr. Garrett. This is about an HOA that has lost sight of its purpose and is operating as a profit center rather than a community organization. Judge Williams listened intently, making notes. Then she turned to Richard Pembroke. "Let me hear from the defense." Richard stood and argued that the HOA had used the road for over 40 years, that everyone had believed it was community property, and that to suddenly strip them of access would create an impossible situation. He presented documents showing the road had been maintained by the HOA, had been repaved using HOA funds, and was listed on county maps as a public access road. "Your Honor, my client is willing to compensate Mr. Garrett fairly for an easement. We have offered $10,000, which we believe is generous, but Mr. Garrett is making unreasonable demands that go far beyond the scope of this property dispute. He is attempting to use his ownership claim as leverage to interfere with the internal governance of the HOA." Judge Williams raised an eyebrow. "What demands are those?" He wants the HOA to rescind a legitimate fine, issue an apology, and change our enforcement policies. These are internal matters that have nothing to do with the easement issue. "Actually," Judge Williams said, "it sounds like these demands are directly related to how this dispute started. Let me ask you directly. Why did the HOA refuse Mr. Garrett's counteroffer? He was asking for no money and offering a permanent easement. The conditions he attached seem reasonable from where I am sitting." Richard hesitated. The board felt that granting his demands would set a bad precedent. A precedent of being flexible and showing compassion to community members. That is the precedent you wanted to avoid. Patricia Henderson stood up from the defendant's table. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Williams looked surprised but nodded. "You may." Patricia walked forward, her posture rigid. "Your Honor, the HOA exists to maintain property values and community standards. If we start making exceptions to our rules, the entire system breaks down. Mr. Garrett violated our covenants. He must face the consequences. We cannot run a community on feelings and sob stories." The courtroom went very quiet. Even Richard Pembroke looked like he wanted to disappear. Judge Williams leaned forward. "Miss Henderson, are you saying that the HOA has no mechanism for showing mercy or flexibility in exceptional circumstances?" "That is correct, Your Honor. The rules apply equally to everyone." "I see." Judge Williams made a note. "You may sit down." The hearing continued for another hour, with both sides presenting additional arguments and evidence. Finally, Judge Williams called for a recess to review the materials and make her decision. Marcus and I waited in the hallway. "That thing Patricia said was either brilliant or the stupidest thing she could have done," he whispered. "I cannot tell which yet." 45 minutes later, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Williams had several pages of notes in front of her. "I have reviewed all the evidence and arguments presented today," she began. "On the matter of property ownership, I find that the plaintiff, Quincy Garrett, does indeed own the parcel of land in question. The title history is clear and unbroken. The defendant HOA has failed to demonstrate any recorded easement or legal right-of-way." There were gasps from the gallery. Patricia's face went pale. On the matter of prescriptive easement, Judge Williams continued, the evidence suggests that the original property owner gave permission, even if informal, for the road to be constructed. This negates the hostility requirement. Furthermore, I am not convinced that the defendants have met their burden of proving continuous, uninterrupted use for the required 20-year period, given the gaps in documentation and the various ownership changes of the HOA itself. She paused and looked directly at Patricia Henderson. However, I am deeply troubled by what I have heard today about the HOA's governance practices. The evidence presented by the plaintiff regarding fine amounts and enforcement patterns suggests a system that has become punitive rather than constructive. Ms. Henderson's statement that the HOA has no mechanism for flexibility or mercy is particularly concerning. Judge Williams shuffled her papers. Here is my ruling. Mr. Garrett owns the access road. The HOA has no automatic right to use it. However, I am not going to leave 147 families without access to their homes. I am ordering both parties to negotiate in good faith for 60 days to establish a reasonable easement agreement. If you cannot reach an agreement, this court will impose one. She looked at Patricia. And let me be very clear. Good faith negotiation means both parties come to the table with reasonable expectations and a willingness to compromise. It does not mean digging in your heels and refusing to budge. Finally, she turned to the issue of the fine. As for the HOA's lien on Mr. Garrett's property, I am issuing a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing it until the easement matter is resolved. The plaintiff has raised serious questions about the legitimacy and proportionality of that fine, and those questions need to be addressed. Judge Williams slammed her gavel. Court is adjourned. I expect to hear from both parties within 60 days with either an executed agreement or a very good explanation for why one could not be reached. We filed out of the courtroom. Marcus was grinning. That went better than I expected. She basically told them they need to give you what you want. Patricia and her attorneys rushed past us without making eye contact, but several of the residents approached me in the hallway. Dorothy Martinez hugged me, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for standing up to her." A man in his 40s introduced himself as Tom Riley. "A bunch of us have been talking. We want to call a special meeting to vote Patricia out as president. After what the judge said today, I think we finally have enough support." I was surprised. "Really? She has been terrible for this community," Tom said. "We have all been too intimidated to do anything about it, but you showed us it is possible to fight back. We are going to try to get signatures for a special election." Over the next 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. Tom and Dorothy organized a petition drive to force a special election for HOA board positions. They needed signatures from 50% of homeowners, which seemed like an impossible task given Patricia's iron grip on the community. But the judge's ruling had changed the dynamic. Homeowners who had been silent for years started speaking up. Stories emerged of excessive fines, harassment, and abuse of power. The petition gathered signatures quickly. Patricia tried to fight it, claiming the bylaws did not allow for special elections, but Tom had done his homework. The bylaws actually did allow for it under certain circumstances, and those circumstances had been met. Meanwhile, I was supposed to be negotiating with the HOA about the easement. Richard Pembroke reached out to schedule a meeting, but Patricia kept delaying it. She was clearly hoping to stay in power long enough to control the negotiation. That hope died when the petition succeeded. A special election was scheduled for March 15th, about 4 weeks after the court hearing. 5 new candidates emerged to challenge the existing board members, including Tom and Dorothy. I watched from the sidelines as the community mobilized. There were town halls where people shared their experiences with the HOA's enforcement practices. A local news station picked up the story, running a segment about HOA abuse and featuring interviews with several Highland Meadows residents. Patricia refused to comment, but her silence spoke volumes. On election day, I went to vote even though I had never been particularly involved in community affairs before. The turnout was unprecedented, over 80% of homeowners. The results were not even close. Patricia Henderson and 3 of her allies on the board were voted out by massive margins. Tom Riley won the presidency with 72% of the vote. Dorothy Martinez was elected to the board along with 3 other reform-minded candidates. The new board was sworn in immediately, and one of their first acts was to schedule a negotiation meeting with me about the easement. We met in the community center on a Tuesday evening. Tom, Dorothy, and the new treasurer, a woman named Linda Foster, sat across from me and Marcus. The atmosphere was completely different from my previous interactions with the HOA. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of the community," Tom said. "The way you were treated was wrong. That fine was ridiculous, and Patricia's refusal to negotiate was inexcusable." "I appreciate that," I said. "We reviewed your original counteroffer," Dorothy said, "and we want to accept it. We will rescind the fine, issue a formal written apology, and we are already working on implementing a hardship exemption policy. We have also decided to do a complete audit of all fines issued over the past 5 years. Any that seem excessive or unfair will be reviewed and potentially refunded." I was honestly stunned. This was more than I had hoped for. "In exchange," Tom said, "you would grant us a permanent easement to use the access road. We will maintain it, repair it, and handle all associated costs. You would have no financial obligation whatsoever." Marcus looked at me. I nodded. "That sounds fair." Linda pulled out a contract they had already drafted. Marcus reviewed it carefully, suggesting a few minor changes, and by the end of the meeting, we had an agreement. The easement would be filed with the county, making it a permanent part of the property records. My fine was officially rescinded with a formal letter of apology that acknowledged the HOA's error. But the story did not end there. As the new board began their audit of past fines, they uncovered something troubling. Patricia Henderson had been systematically targeting certain homeowners, particularly those she had personal conflicts with. The fines in many cases were completely unwarranted, based on violations that did not actually exist or interpretations of the rules that were stretched beyond recognition. More disturbingly, they found irregularities in the HOA's financial records. Money from fines that should have been used for community improvements had been redirected in ways that were not properly documented. Some of it had gone to inflated salaries for Patricia and her allies. Some of it had simply disappeared. Tom contacted me about 3 weeks after the easement agreement was signed. "We found something, and I think you should know about it. We are going to have to bring in law enforcement." He showed me the financial records. Over the past 5 years, Patricia had essentially embezzled about $75,000 from the HOA through a combination of inflated expense reimbursements, fake vendor payments, and unauthorized salary bonuses. She had been careful about it, keeping individual amounts small enough to avoid detection, but the pattern was unmistakable. "We are filing a police report tomorrow," Tom said. "I wanted to tell you first since you are the one who really started this ball rolling." The Boulder Police Department took the complaint seriously. A detective named Sarah Chen was assigned to the case. She interviewed board members, reviewed financial records, and traced payments. The investigation took about 6 weeks, but eventually they had enough evidence to move forward. Patricia Henderson was arrested on a Thursday morning in late April. The charges included theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The local news covered it extensively, with reporters digging into the broader story of HOA abuse and corruption. I got a call from a producer at a Denver television station, asking if I would be willing to be interviewed about my experience. I agreed, figuring it might help other people who were dealing with similar situations. The interview aired on the evening news. I talked about the snow removal fine, discovering I owned the access road, and how the community had come together to remove a corrupt board. The story struck a chord. Within days, I was hearing from people all over Colorado who had their own HOA horror stories. Patricia's criminal case moved through the court system over the next several months. She initially tried to fight the charges, claiming the money had been properly authorized, but the evidence was overwhelming. In August, she pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence of 3 years probation, full restitution of the embezzled funds, and community service. She was also banned from serving on any HOA board in Colorado for the rest of her life. The resolution felt appropriate, if not entirely satisfying. She avoided jail time, but her reputation was destroyed. She lost her position of power, and she had to pay back everything she had stolen. Meanwhile, Highland Meadows was transforming under the new board. Tom and Dorothy implemented the hardship exemption policy, created a transparent appeals process for fines, and reduced overall fine amounts to be more reasonable. They also changed the bylaws to prevent any future board from accumulating too much unchecked power. The community became friendlier, more relaxed. People were not constantly worried about being fined for minor infractions. Block parties started happening again. The HOA went back to being what it was supposed to be, an organization that maintained common areas and helped neighbors coordinate on shared concerns, not a punitive enforcement machine. As for me, I became something of an unlikely hero in the community. People would wave when I drove past, invite me to gatherings, thank me for standing up to Patricia. It was strange and a little uncomfortable, but also kind of nice. I had lived in Highland Meadows for 3 years feeling like an outsider, and now I actually felt like part of a community. Dorothy became a good friend. We would have coffee together every couple of weeks, and she would fill me in on HOA gossip and politics. She seemed to have a new lightness about her, no longer weighed down by constant harassment. "You know what the best part is?" she told me one afternoon in June. "I can have my garden gnome back without worrying about being fined. I know that sounds silly, but that gnome was a gift from my late husband. Patricia made me get rid of it, said it was tacky and violated community standards. I put it back out last week, right in the front garden where it belongs." I smiled. "I am glad you got your gnome back." "It is not about the gnome, not really," Dorothy said. "It is about being treated with dignity, about living in my own home without feeling like I am being watched and judged constantly. You gave us that back." I did not know what to say to that. I had not set out to be anyone's hero. I had just been angry about an unfair fine and stubborn enough not to let it go. But somehow that stubbornness had led to real change for a lot of people. The legal bills had been substantial, about $15,000 total, but I considered it money well spent. Tom and the new board had offered to have the HOA reimburse me from the funds recovered from Patricia, but I declined. It felt important that I had done this on my own, without accepting any kind of payment or compensation. In September, the HOA held its annual meeting. It was the first one I had bothered to attend since the special election. Tom presented an annual report showing improved finances, reduced complaints, and higher community satisfaction. He also presented me with a plaque thanking me for my dedication to justice and community improvement. I accepted it awkwardly while everyone applauded, feeling embarrassed but also touched. After the meeting, a young couple approached me. They had recently moved into Highland Meadows and wanted to hear the full story of what had happened. I gave them the abbreviated version, and they listened with wide eyes. "That is incredible," the woman said. "We almost did not buy here because of all the negative reviews online about the HOA. But then we saw the news stories about the changes, and it seemed like things had really turned around." "They have," I assured her. "It is a good community now." And it was true. Highland Meadows had become the kind of place I was happy to call home. The access road that I technically owned but had granted an easement for was repaved that fall, smooth and well-maintained. Every time I drove over it, I thought about the bizarre chain of events that had led from a snow removal fine to uncovering embezzlement and reforming an entire HOA. Life settled into a comfortable routine. I continued my freelance software development work, now with considerably less stress. The lawsuit and all the associated drama had been exhausting, but in retrospect, it had been worth it. In November, almost a year after the original fine notice had arrived, I received a letter from Tom. It was the annual HOA newsletter, which under Patricia's leadership had been a dry recitation of rules and violations. The new version was actually interesting, featuring profiles of neighbors, announcements about community events, and even a recipe exchange section. There was also a note from Tom, written personally to me. "Quincy, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on what this year has meant for Highland Meadows. When you challenged that fine and discovered the access road situation, you set in motion a series of events that fundamentally changed our community for the better. We removed a corrupt leadership, reformed our governance practices, and remembered what it means to be good neighbors. None of that would have happened without your courage and determination. Thank you for not backing down. Thank you for standing up not just for yourself, but for all of us. With gratitude and respect, Tom." I put the newsletter on my refrigerator, right where Patricia's fine notice had once been pinned. It felt like a fitting symbol of how much had changed. The winter came again, bringing snow just like it had the year before. This time, when the first big storm hit, I cleared my driveway within the required 24 hours. Not because I was afraid of being fined, but because it was the right thing to do and because I was physically able to do it. The day after the storm, Dorothy called to check on me. "Just wanted to make sure you are feeling all right, not sick like last year." "I am good," I said, appreciating her thoughtfulness. "Driveway is clear, no violations here," she laughed. "Well, even if there were, we are much more reasonable about that now. We actually had someone petition for an extension this week because they are recovering from surgery. The board approved it unanimously and even arranged for a neighbor to help with their snow removal. Can you imagine that happening a year ago? Not even a little bit," I admitted. As December rolled around, Highland Meadows organized a holiday party in the community center. I normally avoided these kinds of social events, but I decided to make an exception. The room was decorated with lights and garland. There was hot cider and cookies, and people seemed genuinely happy to be there. I found myself talking to neighbors I had only waved to before, learning their stories, making connections. It struck me how much I had been missing by keeping to myself for so long. The HOA drama had forced me out of my shell, and while it had been stressful and difficult, it had ultimately led to something positive. Near the end of the evening, Tom clinked a glass to get everyone's attention. I just want to say a few words before we wrap up. This has been a year of tremendous change for our community. We faced some hard truths about how we were being governed and how we were treating each other. But we came together, we made changes, and we are now stronger and more united than ever. I am proud to be part of this community, and I am grateful to everyone who fought for these reforms. Let's carry this spirit forward into the new year. People applauded, and someone started singing a holiday song. I stood there with a cup of cider in my hand, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, and felt genuinely content. The access road that had started this whole mess was just outside, covered in a light dusting of snow, leading into the community that I was now truly a part of. The legal resolution was complete, the bad actors had been held accountable, and the community had reformed itself. It was as close to a perfect ending as I could have hoped for. The cynical part of me wondered if it would last, if old patterns would eventually reassert themselves. But looking around at the faces of my neighbors, at Tom and Dorothy and all the others who had worked so hard for change, I chose to be optimistic, sometimes standing up to bullies' works. Sometimes the system can be reformed. Sometimes a ridiculous HOA fine over snow removal can lead to uncovering corruption and creating real positive change. It was not the story I expected to be living when I inherited my grandfather's house, but it was one I was proud to have been part of. The holidays passed peacefully. January came again, marking a full year since the fine notice that had started everything. I found myself thinking about my grandfather, wondering if he had any idea that his informal handshake agreement about a road decades ago would eventually lead to all of this. Probably not. Life has a way of creating unexpected connections and consequences. I received a final piece of closure in February when the easement was officially recorded with Boulder County. The document was properly filed, indexed, and made part of the permanent property record. The access road was now legally established as an easement serving the Highland Meadows community, with all terms clearly defined and agreed upon. No future owner of my property or any future HOA board could claim confusion about the arrangement. Marcus sent me a copy of the recorded document along with a note. This has been one of the most interesting cases of my career. You took a bad situation and turned it into an opportunity for real change. Not many people would have had the courage or the stubbornness to see it through. Well done. I framed the easement document and hung it in my home office, a reminder of what can happen when you refuse to accept injustice, even over something as seemingly trivial as a snow removal fine. It was not about the money or even about the road, not really. It was about standing up for yourself and for others, about holding powerful people accountable, and about building the kind of community where people treat each other with respect and compassion. Highland Meadows was not perfect. There were still occasional disputes and disagreements, as there are in any community, but the culture had fundamentally shifted. The HOA was no longer an adversary to be feared but a tool for neighbors to coordinate and support each other. Fines were rare and proportionate when they did occur. The hardship exemption policy was used regularly and fairly. People actually wanted to serve on the board now, seeing it as an opportunity to help rather than to wield power. I continued to live quietly in my grandfather's house, working on software projects, shoveling snow in a timely manner, and occasionally attending community events. The access road remained well maintained, serving its purpose without controversy. Patricia Henderson's name became a cautionary tale in local HOA circles, an example of what happens when power goes unchecked. In March, I ran into Richard Pembroke, the attorney who had represented the HOA during the lawsuit. He was at a coffee shop in Boulder, and we ended up talking for a few minutes. I have to say, that case was professionally humiliating but personally enlightening, he told me. I have started turning down HOA clients that show signs of the kind of aggressive enforcement patterns your HOA had. Life is too short to defend bullies, even if they pay well. Good for you, I said, and I meant it. He smiled ruefully. Patricia was a nightmare client anyway. She kept insisting we fight you on principle even when it was clear she was wrong. I am glad the judge saw through it. We parted ways amicably, and I walked home thinking about how many lives had been touched by this situation. Not just the residents of Highland Meadows, but attorneys like Richard who were rethinking their practices. Other communities that heard the story and started questioning their own HOA governance. People dealing with similar situations who realized they did not have to just accept abuse. The following months passed uneventfully, which was exactly what I wanted. I celebrated my birthday in April with Dorothy and a few other neighbors, just a simple dinner at a local restaurant. We talked about normal things like gardening plans and vacation ideas, not HOA drama or property disputes. It felt wonderful to have ordinary conversations with friends. By the time summer arrived, the events of the previous year had taken on an almost dreamlike quality. Had I really challenged an entire HOA over a snow removal fine? Had I really discovered I owned their access road? Had I really helped bring down a corrupt board president? It all seemed unlikely, yet the evidence was everywhere. The framed easement document on my wall, the plaque from the community, the friendships I had formed, the transformed HOA that actually served its community well. I received occasional emails from people around the country who had heard my story and were dealing with their own HOA problems. I tried to respond helpfully, sharing what I had learned, encouraging them to stand up for themselves, but also to choose their battles wisely. Not every fight is worth having, but some absolutely are. In August, Highland Meadows celebrated its 50th anniversary with a big community festival. There were food trucks, a live band, games for kids, and a historical display showing the development's evolution over the decades. One of the historical photos showed the access road being built in the 1970s, a dirt path through empty land. I stood looking at that photo for a long time, thinking about my grandfather and the informal agreement that had led to so much drama decades later. Tom found me there and stood beside me, looking at the same photo. It is strange how things work out, is it not? That road has been there for 50 years, and for 49 of those years, nobody questioned who owned it. Then you come along and suddenly everything changes. Do you think I should have just paid the fine and let it go? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Tom shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. If you had done that, Patricia would still be president, still targeting people, still embezzling money. This community needed someone to stand up to her, and you did. The road thing was just the leverage you needed, but the fight was always about justice, not property rights. I had never quite thought of it that way, but he was right. The access road had been a tool, a way to force accountability. But the real issue had always been about fairness, about how people should be treated, about what kind of community we wanted to live in. The anniversary celebration went late into the evening. I stayed until the end, helping clean up alongside other volunteers. As I carried folding chairs back to the storage shed, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This community had been broken, and now it was healing. I had played a role in that, but so had many others. Tom, Dorothy, all the homeowners who had voted for change, the new board members who were working hard to govern fairly and transparently. It had been a collective effort. Walking home that night under a sky full of stars, I thought about the journey I had been on. A year and a half ago, I had been a loner, keeping to myself, avoiding engagement with my community. A single unjust fine had changed everything, leading me down a path of discovery, conflict, and ultimately transformation, not just of the HOA but of myself. I had learned that I was capable of standing up to powerful people, of persisting through difficult situations, of making a real difference. I had learned the value of community and friendship. I had learned that sometimes the things that seem like disasters in the moment can lead to profound positive changes. The house felt welcoming as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. My grandfather's house, my house, sitting on property that included a small but crucial piece of road that had turned out to be far more significant than anyone could have imagined. I made a cup of tea and sat in my living room, enjoying the quiet. There would be no more dramatic confrontations, no more court hearings, no more investigations. Just ordinary life in a community that had learned some hard lessons and come out better for it. The access road would continue to serve its purpose, quietly and without controversy. The HOA would continue to function, but with compassion and accountability. And I would continue to live here, no longer an isolated outsider but a valued member of the community. It was, I reflected, a pretty good outcome for something that had started with such anger and frustration. The $1,500 fine that Patricia had levied against me had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom from criminal charges. Meanwhile, I had gained friends, a real sense of home, and the satisfaction of knowing I had helped create positive change. As I finished my tea and prepared for bed, I felt genuinely at peace. The fight was over, justice had been served, and life could return to normal. But it was a better normal, a transformed normal, built on lessons learned and hard-won reforms. Highland Meadows was not perfect, but it was good, and it was home. The access road would continue to carry people to their houses, just as it had for 50 years. But now it did so under a clear legal framework, owned by me, used by the community through a properly executed easement, maintained cooperatively, and symbolizing not conflict but resolution. Every car that drove over it was a reminder that problems can be solved, that corruption can be exposed, that communities can heal, and that sometimes one person standing up for what is right can make all the difference. That was the real story, I realized as I drifted off to sleep. Not about property disputes or HOA regulations, but about courage, community, and the possibility of change. The snow removal fine had been an injustice. Discovering the access road had been fortunate, but what really mattered was what came after. People coming together to demand better, to hold leaders accountable, to build something worth being part of. Highland Meadows was that something now, a community that had faced its problems and emerged stronger. And I was grateful in a strange way for that certified letter that had arrived on a Tuesday morning so many months ago. Without it, none of this transformation would have happened. Sometimes, it turns out, the worst things lead to the best outcomes. You just have to be willing to fight for them.